year 1872 had bled all the softness from the land, leaving bone and dust. Here, on the hem of Nebraska territory where the wind blew clean from Wyoming, the Platte River was the only thing that moved with purpose. It was a thick, muscular artery, the color of churned earth, that cut through a landscape of stubborn grit and pale, thirsty grass, near its bank, in the dying slant of a Tuesday sun. Lila Mae Carter worked, her small figure a study in solitude. She was 18, an age that in other places might have promised dances and ribbons and the shy glances of suitors. For Lila, it promised only the familiar ache in her back and the coarse feel of the burlap sack she was mending. The sun, a molten copper coin slipping behind the bluffs, threw a theatrical blood-orange light across the plains, turning the dust motes into a glittering haze. It was the kind of sunset that made a person feel small, a temporary witness to something ancient and indifferent. Lila felt it deep in her marrow. She paused her needle, her hands chapped and raw, and watched the river flow. It was a powerful, hungry thing, always taking, carrying silt and secrets downstream to a world she could only imagine. Her world was a 3-room sod cabin, a patch of stubborn corn, and the endless, whispering prairie. It was a life measured in buckets of water hauled in meager suppers cooked over a smoky fire. She dreamed of things she had no words for, a yearning for a horizon that wasn't fenced in by duty and poverty, a feeling of space, of air that didn't smell of wood smoke and worry. But dreams, in this place, were a luxury. Her father's voice, rough as a cob, was a permanent echo in her head. A girl who can't earn a cent and only knows how to daydream is about as useful as a screen door on a storm cellar. Hank Carter was a man hardened by failure. The war had taken his brother. The locusts had taken his first 2 crops, and the unforgiving land was slowly taking what was left of his spirit. He saw the world in terms of profit and loss. And Lila, with her quiet ways and her tendency to stare at clouds, was a clear and present loss. She couldn't plow like a son, couldn't bargain in town, and hadn't attracted the eye of any farmer with enough land to make a good match. Her gentleness, the very core of her, was, in his eyes, her greatest failing. Lila finished her stitch, pulling the twine tight with a practiced tug. She folded the heavy sack and rose, her joints protesting. The wind picked up, a low moan that carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Back at the cabin, a sliver of yellow light from a tallow lamp fought against the encroaching twilight. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of boiled potatoes and the fainter, sweeter scent of the herbal poultice her mother used for the cough that rattled in her chest. Rose Carter sat by the fire, her hands, once nimble and strong, now resting fragile and bird-like in her lap. A wasting sickness was slowly claiming her, leaving her with pale skin and eyes that held a universe of unspoken pain. Yet, they still held a fierce, protective love whenever they looked upon her daughter.
"You're late, child,"
Rose said, her voice a reedy whisper.
"The air has a chill to it."
"I was finishing the mending." "Mama." Lila placed the sack by the door and went to the hearth, her presence a small comfort in the dim room. The cabin door swung open, bringing a gust of wind and her father with it. Hank Carter was not a large man, but he filled a room with a heavy, sour energy. He stomped the dust from his boots and hung his hat on a peg without a word, his gaze sweeping the room and finding something to disapprove of. His eyes landed on Lila. "River gazing again, I suppose," he grumbled, his voice scraping like a shovel on rock. "The wood box is near empty and you're off watching the mud roll by." "I'll get it now, Pa," Lila said softly, her shoulders tightening. She knew the argument was futile. Any defense was an act of defiance, and defiance was met with a wall of bitter silence or a sharper, more cutting remark. "See that you do." He pulled a chair to the table and sat with a heavy sigh, the day's labor and disappointment settling on him like a shroud. He began cleaning his rifle, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism filling the cabin, a sound more common than laughter. Lila slipped back outside into the deep purple dusk. The air was colder now. She moved to the woodpile, her motions efficient, her body accustomed to the labor. The stars were beginning to prick the vast, dark canopy above, cold and impossibly far away. Each log she lifted and carried into the cabin felt like a piece of her own confinement. She was strong, her body wiry and tough from a life of work, but it was a strength no one saw. They saw only a quiet, plain girl, a daughter who had not yet been bartered for a few acres or a handful of cattle. In Copper Creek, the nearest collection of buildings that called itself a town, a woman's worth was calculated with brutal simplicity. She was a wife, a mother, a helper. She belonged to a man. First her father, then her husband. Independence was a fantasy, a dangerous one. Lila had seen what happened to women who tried to live on their own terms. They became objects of suspicion and scorn, their loneliness a public spectacle. The law, embodied by the tall, unsmiling figure of Sheriff Denton, had little time for the troubles of a woman and even less for one who didn't fit the mold. The sheriff was a man of straight lines and hard facts, and in his world, a woman without a man was a problem waiting to happen. As she made her last trip from the woodpile, she saw her father standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the lamplight. "Sheriff Denton was by the south pasture today," Hank said, not looking at her but at the darkness beyond. "Looking for someone. A man who robbed the bank over in Julesburg. Says he might have headed this way." Lila's heart gave a little skip of something that felt like fear, but was also threaded with a strange, forbidden curiosity. A man on the run? It was a story she'd heard before, whispered in town. The kind of tale that made the world feel larger and more dangerous than her small corner of it. Did he say what the man looked like? Rose's weak voice drifted from inside. "Just a man, another drifter with a gun and no sense." Hank grunted, dismissing the topic. He looked at Lila as she stacked the last of the logs. "Old man Hemlock's boy, Thomas, is looking for a wife. He's got a good plot of land. Sturdy." Lila felt a cold dread creep up her spine. Thomas Hemlock was a thick-necked, silent boy with small, dull eyes and dirt permanently lodged under his fingernails. The thought of being his wife, of moving from this sod cabin to his, of trading one silence for another, was like a stone in her stomach. I don't know him well." "Pa," she stammered, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. "There's nothing to know. He's got land and he needs a wife. You're of age and you need a husband. It's simple arithmetic," Hank said, his tone final. He turned and went back inside. The conversation, in his mind, concluded. Lila remained outside for a moment longer, breathing in the cold night air. The river murmured in the darkness, a constant, soothing sound. It didn't judge. It didn't demand. It simply flowed. She looked up at the Milky Way, a brilliant, shimmering scar across the infinite black. Downstream, somewhere past the horizon, was a world where a woman might be more than a line in a man's ledger. A place where her worth wasn't measured in acres or suns. She didn't know if that place was real, but the hope of it was a tiny, resilient flame inside her. It was a foolish, useless hope, her father would say, but on nights like this, alone under the vast, uncaring sky, it was the only thing she truly owned. The storm came without warning, a malevolent bruise that spread across the afternoon sky. It broke upon the plains with a fury that seemed personal, a biblical rage aimed at their small, tenacious hold on the land. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the sod roof of the cabin, and the rain came not in drops, but in sheets, turning the world outside the single window into a churning, gray chaos. Lila sat with her mother, holding her hand as the little cabin trembled with each concussive blast of thunder. Hank had secured the mule in its lean-to and was now sitting by the cold hearth, his rifle across his lap, as if he could stand against the storm with powder and lead. For hours, the world was reduced to water and noise, the Platte River roaring in the darkness like a beast unshackled. By morning, The fury had passed. A profound, ringing silence settled over a world that felt bruised and baptized. When Lila stepped outside, the air was sharp and clean, scrubbed of dust. The ground was a sodden mess, the cornstalks beaten flat, but it was the river that held her gaze. It was a different entity entirely. Yesterday's sluggish, muddy artery was now a gorged brown snake, swollen and violent, its surface boiling with eddies and whirlpools. It had consumed its banks and was now chewing at the roots of the cottonwoods, carrying a freight of broken branches, fence posts, and the sad detritus of other lives lived upstream. Drawn by a mix of awe and trepidation, Lila walked toward it. A thick mist clung to the water like a shroud, and the rising sun struggled to pierce it, casting down ethereal shafts of pale, golden light. It was in one of these beams, tangled in a snag of driftwood and riverweed not 20 yards from where she stood, that she saw it. A patch of dark, heavy cloth, a shape that was wrong. Too solid for a shadow, too still for the current. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a man. He was face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for a shore he would never find. For a long moment, she was frozen, a statue of prairie girl caution. Her father's words about drifters and outlaws, Sheriff Denton's warning, the innate fear of the unknown, it all screamed at her to turn back, to run to the cabin and pretend she had seen nothing. He was likely dead. And if he wasn't, he was trouble. In this land, trouble was a contagion, and her family had no resistance to it. But then she saw it. A slight, almost imperceptible movement of his back. Or perhaps it was just the river, toying with its prize. It didn't matter. In that instant, the years of quiet obedience and suppressed instinct fell away. This was not a problem of arithmetic, as her father would say. It was a human being, drowning in the mud. For the first time in her life, a decision rose up from a place deeper than fear, a place that was purely her own. She hitched up her worn skirts and waded in. The cold was a physical blow, a shock that stole her breath and made her muscles seize. The riverbed was a treacherous slurry of mud and unseen rocks that sucked at her worn boots, threatening to pull her down with him. The current, even this close to the new bank, was a powerful, insistent hand pushing against her legs. She fought her way forward, her teeth chattering, her focus narrowed to the dark shape in the water. When she reached him, she grabbed the collar of his woolen coat. He was a dead weight of soaked cloth and bone, far heavier than he looked. She pulled, her feet sinking deeper into the mud. He didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She couldn't do it. She was a girl of 18, not a man with a team of oxen. She took a breath, the misty air burning her lungs, and tried again. She dug her heels into the slick earth, wrapped both hands in his coat, and leaned back, using every ounce of her wiry strength. The mud fought her, the river fought her, but she pulled with a desperate, primal force. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to move. She dragged him inch by painful inch out of the main current and onto the slick, muddy bank. He collapsed into a heap, water streaming from his clothes, his face as pale as river stone. He looked to be in his late 20s, his dark hair plastered to his skull, a rough stubble on his jaw. A deep gash ran along his temple, and as she pushed aside the torn fabric of his shirt, she saw the cause of his trouble, a dark, blossoming stain on his shoulder, the puckered, angry-looking hole of a bullet wound. She leaned down close, her ear near his mouth, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She felt nothing. She watched his chest. Nothing. For a terrible second, she thought she had fought the river for a dead man. Then she saw it, a tiny puff of condensation in the cold air, a gasp as thin as a thread. He was alive. At that moment, the sun finally broke through the thinning mist, its light cutting a clean wound in the fog and illuminating the scene, the half-drowned man, the exhausted girl, and the muddy water that had delivered him. The river, the great divider, the boundary between life and death. And she had pulled him back across it. Panic returned. But this time, it was practical. She couldn't leave him here. The sun would bake him, or the river would rise again and reclaim him. And she couldn't take him to the cabin. Her father would give him over to the sheriff without a second thought, especially for a reward. The old, dilapidated barn, its roof sagging and its walls full of gaps, was the only place. Summoning a strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to get him onto his back and began the grueling task of dragging him up the slight incline toward the barn. She half pulled, half carried him, his boots leaving 2 long, dark trails in the wet earth. Inside, the barn smelled of hay rot and disuse. She cleared a space in a dusty, empty stall and gently lowered him onto a pile of old burlap sacks. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy and cold. She worked quickly, her hands clumsy but determined, stripping off his soaked coat and shirt. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, leaving a ragged exit wound on his back. It was ugly, but it didn't seem to have hit the bone. She used a piece of his own torn shirt to clean the wounds as best she could. Tucked inside his coat, she found a small, heavy object on a chain. It was a silver locket, shaped like a heart, tarnished by the water. She worked the clasp with her cold fingers, and it sprang open. Inside was no portrait, only a name etched in a delicate script, Evelyn. She spent the next hour making him as comfortable as she could, covering him with more dry sacks. She slipped back to the cabin, her own clothes soaked and muddy, her heart a frantic drum. Her father was out assessing the storm's damage, and her mother was asleep. Lila changed into dry clothes, her mind racing. What had she done? She was harboring a fugitive, a man with a bullet in him, the very man Sheriff Denton was hunting. She returned to the barn with a canteen of fresh water and some strips of clean linen she'd taken from her own meager supply. He was still unconscious. She sat on an overturned bucket, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, the weight of her decision settling upon her. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. She was no longer just Hank Carter's daydreaming daughter. She was a girl with a secret that was breathing raggedly in the hay-scented dark. Late in the afternoon, his eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a stormy sky, clouded with pain and confusion. He tried to sit up, a sharp groan escaping his lips as the movement pulled at his shoulder. "Easy now," Lila said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She moved closer, holding out the canteen. "You're safe." His eyes darted around the dim barn, then settled on her face. They were sharp, assessing eyes, the eyes of a man who was no stranger to waking up in unfamiliar places. "Where?" he rasped, his voice rough. "My family's farm. I found you in the river." He seemed to process this slowly. He touched his shoulder, his fingers coming away sticky with blood. "The river," he repeated, as if tasting the word. He looked at her again. "Who are you?" "Lila Mae Carter." He didn't offer his own name. He took the canteen she offered and drank deeply, the water spilling down his chin. "I was chased," he said, the memory seeming to surface in fragments. "My horse went down at the crossing." Lila's heart pounded. This was it. "The sheriff was by here yesterday," she said, the words rushing out. "He's looking for a man, a bank robber from Julesburg." His expression didn't change, but a new hardness settled in his eyes, a shudder coming down. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He simply watched her, his silence a heavy thing in the small space. "You should have left me in the water," he said, his voice flat. "I couldn't," she answered, the truth of it simple and unadorned. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of his labored breathing and the drip of water from the leaky roof. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was in over her head. The law was a hard, simple thing, like her father's arithmetic. A man robs a bank. He hangs. A person who helps him is an accomplice. But the man in the barn was not a number in an equation. He was flesh and blood and breath, a life she had fought the river to save. Her fear was a living thing, a cold knot in her gut, but her compassion, that useless, gentle part of her, was stronger. She had pulled him from the water, and in doing so, had tied her fate to his. She didn't know his name, or his crime, or who Evelyn was, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. She had stepped across a line, and the whole vast, dangerous West had just opened up before her. The days that followed settled into a precarious rhythm. A secret life lived in the margins of the other. The barn became Lila's sanctuary, and her prison, the place where she felt most alive and most terrified. She would steal away 3 times a day, with a small portion of their meager meals hidden in her apron, her heart a frantic bird in her chest until she was safely inside the shadowy quiet. His name, he told her on the 2nd day, was Cole. He said it simply, his voice still rough from the river, and the name seemed to fit him. It was short, hard, and unadorned, like a piece of rock. He ate the food she brought with a slow, deliberate hunger that spoke of a long acquaintance with want. He rarely spoke of his own accord, but his eyes, those stormy, observant eyes, missed nothing. He watched her mend his torn shirt with her small, neat stitches. He watched the way she moved, a quiet efficiency born of a lifetime of labor. And she, in turn, watched him. She saw the pain that tightened his jaw when he moved his shoulder, and the profound weariness that settled on his features when he thought she wasn't looking. His healing was a slow, stubborn process. At first, he did little more than sleep, a deep, exhausted sleep that seemed to be a retreat from the world. But as the days bled into a week, a restless energy began to stir in him. He started to move around the barn, testing his strength, his gaze often fixed on the world outside through the cracks in the weathered plank walls. From there, he could see the whole of the Carters' hard-scrabble existence, the broken fence line where the wind had toppled 2 posts, the persistent lean of the woodshed, the way the old mule, Patches, favored a front hoof. "That fence won't keep a determined jackrabbit out, let alone a stray steer," he said one afternoon, his voice startling her. She was replacing the soiled linen on his shoulder. "Pa will get to it when he has time," she said, her standard defense for the farm's endless state of disrepair. "Time is one thing a man in this country never has enough of," Cole said. He nodded toward a pile of old tools in the corner. "There's a post-hole digger there, and an axe that looks like it can still hold an edge. The work's not hard if you know the angle of it." Lila looked from the tools to him, a flicker of an idea taking root. "Pa he don't like me handling the heavy tools." A ghost of a smile touched Cole's lips. A rare and startling event. A tool doesn't know whose hand is holding it. Lila, it only knows if the hand is steady. And so began the lessons, under the cloak of dusk, when her father was either in town or asleep by the fire. Lila would slip out to the barn, and Cole would teach her. He showed her how to brace the fence posts, how to wrap the wire so it held its tension, his larger, calloused hands guiding her own. His touch was impersonal, instructive, yet it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the work. He spoke in a low, patient voice, explaining the logic of things, the simple physics of leverage and balance. For the first time, the farm was not just a collection of chores, but a system she could understand and influence. Next was the mule. Patches was a stubborn, placid creature, used mostly for hauling water and pulling the small plow. Lila had ridden him before, but always bareback, a clumsy, bouncing affair. Cole showed her how to fashion a better bridle from a piece of old rope, how to sit centered and low, how to guide the animal not with panicked pulling but with gentle pressure from her knees. "You're telling him a story," Cole explained, his hand resting lightly on her back to adjust her posture. "Let him know where you want to go before you get there. Animals, like most men, don't take kindly to surprises." She began to take Patches out in the early mornings. Before the sun was fully up, riding along the riverbank, it was a feeling of pure, unbridled freedom, the wind in her hair, the world unfolding before her. She felt a confidence she'd never known, a sense of control over her own movement, her own direction. It was a dangerous, addictive feeling. Their time together was woven from these quiet moments of instruction and the long hours spent in the hay-scented dimness of the barn. Trust was the fragile currency they traded in. She trusted him not to bring harm to her family. He trusted her not to betray him to the law. Yet a vast, unspoken territory lay between them. She knew he was running from something more than just a robbery. And he knew she was hiding him from more than just the sheriff. One evening, as a spectacular sunset bled purple and orange across the plains, he began to talk. It wasn't a confession, but a series of disjointed memories, painted in the spare, stark language of a man who'd seen too much. He spoke of Texas, of the immense, crushing heat and the long cattle drives where the sky was so big it could swallow a man's soul. He talked of the war, not of battles or glory, but of the aftermath, of boys who went to fight for a cause and came home to find their farms seized by banks, their families scattered. "They give you a medal and a handshake and send you on your way," he said, his voice low and bitter, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the barn wall. "And the same men who waved the flags and made the speeches are the ones signing the papers that take your land. They call it law, they call it progress, but it's just a different kind of thieving, done with a pen instead of a pistol." Lila listened, rapt. The world she knew was small and simple, governed by the seasons, her father's moods, and the word of God as spoken by the traveling preacher twice a year. Cole's words were like stones dropped into a still pond, sending ripples that disrupted everything she thought she knew. The clear line between right and wrong, between lawman and outlaw, began to blur. She started to see the world not as a set of rules, but as a struggle, where justice was a rare prize, and survival was the only real law. The strain of her secret life began to show. She grew quieter at the supper table, her mind 1,000 miles away in the barn. She jumped at the sound of hoofbeats on the trail, her blood running cold until she saw it was just a neighbor or a lone rider passing through. Her father watched her with a narrow, suspicious gaze. "You're flighty as a spooked hen lately. Girl," Hank commented one night, cleaning his nails with the tip of a knife. "Got something on your mind." "No, Pa, just tired," she mumbled, her eyes on her plate. "See that it's just tiredness," he said, his tone carrying a veiled threat. "Old man Hemlock's asking after you. I told him we'd have a talk come Sunday." The words landed like a physical blow. Sunday, her future, a bleak and airless room, was closing in. The fear was a constant, metallic taste in her mouth. She was falling for the man in the barn. It was a terrifying, hopeless feeling, a love as wild and unsustainable as a prairie fire. And yet, the thought of returning to a life without him, a life of silent obedience with Thomas Hemlock, was a kind of death she could not bear to contemplate. Cole, too, was wrestling with his own demons. He found himself watching Lila, admiring the quiet strength she didn't even know she possessed. She had saved his life with a courage that shamed him. He felt a fierce, protective instinct toward her, a desire to shield her from the harshness of the world, a world he knew all too well, but he was the greatest threat to her. His past was a shadow that could engulf her. If the law found him here, they wouldn't just take him, they would ruin her and her family for harboring him. The guilt gnawed at him. He owed her his life, and all he was doing was putting hers in jeopardy. Some nights, he would lie awake on the rough sacks, the silver locket clutched in his hand, and think about leaving, about disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he had appeared. But the thought of leaving her to her fate, to a life with a man like Thomas Hemlock, was a betrayal he couldn't stomach. He was caught in a trap of his own making, a trap built of gratitude and a feeling so tender and new it had no name. The rider appeared as a dark speck against the vast, bleached canvas of the morning sky, growing steadily larger until he resolved into the unmistakable figure of Sheriff Denton. He rode not with haste, but with a slow, methodical pace that seemed to devour the distance. his presence casting a long, sharp shadow over the land. Lila was drawing water from the well, and the sight of him made the bucket handle slip in her sweaty grasp. It clattered against the stone wall of the well, the sound unnaturally loud in the still air. He reined in his horse a few feet from her, not dismounting. Denton was a man made of straight lines and hard angles. From his square jaw to the crisp crease in his hat, his eyes, the color of washed-out denim, took in everything at once: the muddy hem of Lila's dress, the tension in her shoulders, the way she refused to meet his gaze. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice as dry as the dust his horse had kicked up. "Sheriff," Lila managed, her own voice a small, tight thing. "Storm treated you folks all right?" he asked, his gaze drifting from her to the cabin, then to the leaning barn. It was a casual question that felt like an accusation. "We managed. Lost some corn is all. River was running high. Saw it took out a good piece of the bank down by the crossing," he continued, letting the silence hang after his words. A thing like that can wash up all sorts of surprises. Lila's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her eyes on the ground, focusing on a loose stone near her boot. "We ain't seen nothing unusual, Sheriff." Just then, Hank emerged from the cabin, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes lit with a mixture of apprehension and a kind of greedy curiosity at the sight of the lawman. "Sheriff Denton, what brings you out to this godforsaken corner?" Hank said, forcing a jovial tone that didn't suit him. "Just making my rounds, Hank, checking on folks after the blow," Denton said, his eyes still on Lila, "and still keeping an eye out for that fellow from Julesburg. A reward's been posted, $50. Gold. $50. The words hung in the air, shimmering like a heat haze. To Hank Carter, it was a fortune. It was seed for next year, a new plow blade, medicine for rows that wasn't just boiled weeds. Lila felt her father's gaze on her, sharp and speculative. She could feel him doing the arithmetic in his head. $50, Hank repeated slowly, stroking his jaw. Well now, a man would be a fool not to keep his eyes peeled for that kind of money. He would at that, Denton said. He finally turned his full attention to Hank. "The man's name is Cole Braddock, ex-cavalry. He's armed and knows how to use his weapon. If you see anything, don't try to be a hero. You just send word to me." He tipped his hat slightly in Lila's direction. "Ma'am." Then he turned his horse and rode away, leaving a thick, anxious silence in his wake. Lila didn't dare look at her father. She busied herself with the water bucket, her hands trembling so badly she could barely get a grip. "Funny how you've been spending so much time out by that old barn lately," Hank said, his voice deceptively casual. "Mending sacks. You said they needed mending." "Pa," she said, her back still to him. $50, he said again, more to himself than to her. He went back into the cabin without another word, but Lila felt his suspicion like a brand on her skin. The days that followed were a quiet torment. Her father's eyes were always on her. He would appear suddenly and silently when she was heading to the barn, asking what she was doing with a tone that suggested he already knew the answer. He began to inventory the food supplies with a new, meticulous attention, questioning why the cornmeal seemed to be disappearing so quickly. Lila lived on a knife's edge of fear, her every move scrutinized. She had to be more careful, visiting Cole only in the dead of night, her heart in her throat with every creak of a floorboard, every rustle in the grass. A week after the sheriff's visit, another storm rolled in. This one was different, a cold, weeping autumn rain that promised the coming winter. It fell for a full day, turning the farm into an island of mud in a gray, desolate sea. The chill seeped into the barn, and Lila worried about Cole's shoulder. A wound like that could turn bad in the damp. That night, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, she slipped out into the relentless drizzle. The barn was a haven of relative warmth and quiet, the drumming of the rain on the roof a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Cole was sitting in the shadows when she entered, the silver locket dangling from his fingers. He looked up, his face etched with worry. "You shouldn't have come out in this," he said, his voice low.
I was worried about your shoulder,
She whispered, setting down a small lantern. Its flickering light cast their shadows, huge and distorted, against the wooden walls.
The cold can't be good for it.
She knelt beside him with a small bundle of clean linen and a jar of her mother's herbal salve. As she began to unwrap the old bandage, she saw him shiver, a deep, bone-rattling tremor. She touched his forehead with the back of her hand. It was warm, too warm.
You have a fever,
she said, her voice tight with alarm. "It's nothing, just the damp," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. She worked in silence, her movements gentle and sure as she cleaned the wound. It was healing, but the flesh around it was an angry red. The rain beat down harder, a furious, lonely sound. "You know my name now," he said suddenly, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him over the storm. She paused, her hands hovering over his shoulder.
Sheriff Denton was here.
He nodded slowly. "And he told you what I did? It wasn't a question." "He said you robbed a bank." Cole was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the flickering lantern flame. "It's true," he finally said. "I did, but it wasn't for the money. Not for me. Anyway." He looked at her then, his stormy eyes searching her face, gauging her. "After the war, me and some of the boys from my troop, we pooled what little we had and bought a piece of land down in the Brazos Valley. Good land. We were going to start a ranch, but a drought came, and we had to take a loan from the bank in Julesburg to see us through, the same bank that held the deeds on half the county." He took a ragged breath. "The rains never came. The bank foreclosed. They took everything, not just from us, from dozens of families. Men who'd lost brothers and sons fighting for the same country that was now letting them starve. We tried to talk to the banker, a man named Sterling. He just laughed, said it was the law. So one night," Cole continued, his voice hardening, "me and 2 others, we went back. We didn't hurt anyone. We just took back what was ours, what was owed to all those families. We had the ledgers. We knew the exact amount, not a dollar more." He looked away, shame and anger warring in his face. It was a fool's plan. "Sterling had a man waiting, one of my friends. He didn't make it. The other one got away clean. I took this." He touched his shoulder. "And I ran." Lila stared at him, her heart aching. The story didn't make him a hero, but it didn't make him the cold-blooded villain the law painted him to be. It made him human, flawed and desperate, a man who had tried to find justice in a world that had none to offer. She finished dressing his wound, her fingers brushing against the warm, feverish skin of his chest. The rain hammered down, isolating them, cocooning them in the small, fragile space. He shivered again, and without thinking, she pulled her shawl from her shoulders and draped it around him. He didn't pull away. She was so close she could feel the heat of his body, see the flicker of the lantern flame reflected in his eyes. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the things they couldn't say. He was a wanted man, and she was a farmer's daughter, promised to another. Their worlds were impossibly, tragically far apart. Yet, in that moment, they were just 2 people, 2 lonely souls taking shelter from the same storm. He slowly raised a hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, as gentle as a whisper, but it sent a shock wave through her entire body. Her breath hitched, their eyes met and held. And in the space of that long, silent gaze, something profound and irrevocable passed between them. It was more than affection. It was a recognition, a deep and powerful empathy for the wounds the world had inflicted upon them both. He was an outcast by law, and she was an outcast by nature, deemed useless by the very people who should have loved her. He leaned in, his face just inches from hers, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. Her eyes fluttered shut, but he stopped, his breath warm on her cheek. The moment stretched, fragile and perfect, a trembling balance of desire and restraint. He was a man holding on to the last vestiges of his honor, and she was a girl clinging to the pure, untainted hope of her first love. To cross that line would be to invite a different kind of storm, one they might not survive. He pulled back, his hand dropping from her face. The spell was broken, but the echo of it remained. "You should go," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Before your father comes looking." She nodded, unable to speak. She gathered her things and stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. At the door, she paused and looked back at him. He was huddled in her shawl, a solitary figure in the lantern light, the weight of his past a tangible presence in the small, dark space. The rain was finally letting up, its frantic drumming softening to a gentle patter. But Lila knew the real storm was just beginning. The betrayal did not come with a thunderclap, but with the quiet closing of the cabin door. The morning after the rain. The world was washed clean, the air holding a deceptive peace. But inside the Carter home, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken things. Hank ate his breakfast in a grim, brooding silence, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. He didn't look at Lila, not once, but she felt his gaze on her like a physical weight. She knew, with the primal instinct of a cornered animal, that the fragile truce between them had been broken. He knew her secret. The only question was what he intended to do with it. Shortly after sunrise, he pushed his chair back, scraped the last of his grits into his mouth, and stood. "Going to town," he announced to the room at large. "Need to see about a new blade for the plow." It was a flimsy excuse. The blade they had was worn but serviceable, and they had no money for a new one. Rose, frail in her chair by the hearth, looked at him with worried eyes. "Hank, there's no need." "I'll be the judge of what's needed," he snapped, cutting her off. He pulled on his worn coat and hat, his movements stiff and deliberate. At the door, he paused, his back to them. "You stay close to the cabin. Lila, don't go wandering." The command was layered with a meaning that turned her blood to ice. He was not just her father, he was her jailer. The door closed behind him, and Lila watched through the window as he hitched Patches to the small buckboard and headed down the trail toward Copper Creek. A small, dark figure shrinking against the immense landscape. A terrible certainty settled in her stomach. He was going to see the sheriff. He was going to trade a man's life for $50. The morning crawled by, each minute an exercise in agony. She tried to work, to feed the chickens and mend a tear in her mother's shawl, but her hands shook and her mind was a whirlwind of frantic, desperate thoughts. She had to warn Cole. She had to get him away. But where could he go? He was still weak, his fever barely broken, and her father had taken the only mule. They were trapped. It was close to noon when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It wasn't the small, lazy plume of a single rider, but a larger, more menacing billow. Her breath caught in her throat. They were coming. She dropped the shawl and ran, her worn boots slipping in the still damp earth, her heart a wild, panicked drum against her ribs. She burst into the barn, her chest heaving. Cole was on his feet, his pistol in his hand. He had seen the dust cloud, too, through a crack in the wall. The fever had left him pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear and hard. There was no surprise in them, only a grim resignation. "It's your father, isn't it?" he said, his voice flat. Tears of shame and fury burned her eyes. "He went to town this morning. I'm so sorry, Cole. I didn't—" "It's not your fault, Lila," he said, his voice softening as he looked at her. He moved to the barn door and peered out. The riders were closer now, maybe 5 or 6 of them, with Sheriff Denton at their head. And riding a little ways behind them, on the buckboard, was her father. He was not looking toward the farm but staring straight ahead, a man trying to outrun his own conscience. "You have to go," Lila pleaded, grabbing Cole's arm. "Out the back. Run for the river. You can hide in the cottonwoods." And then what he said, his gaze not leaving the approaching posse, "They'll hunt me down in an hour. and they'll see you help me escape. They'll take it out on you, on your mother." He looked down at her, his hand covering hers on his arm. "I won't let that happen. I've brought enough trouble to your door." The riders fanned out, forming a loose, menacing semicircle around the front of the barn. Sheriff Denton raised a hand, and they all came to a halt. Cole Braddock Denton's voice boomed across the yard. "Sharp and clear. I know you're in there. This is the law. Come on out with your hands empty."
Silence. The wind whispered through the dry cornstalks. From the cabin, Lila could hear her mother let out a small, frightened cry.
"I'm giving you till the count of 3, Braddock Denton shouted. "Then we're coming in." Cole gave Lila's hand a final squeeze and gently pushed her away from the door, toward the relative safety of a heavy pile of hay bales. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He moved to the side of the door, using the thick frame as cover, his pistol held ready. 1. Lila crouched behind the hay, peering through a gap. She could see them all clearly now. Men from town, their faces grim, rifles held across their saddles. Her father had stopped the buckboard and was just sitting there, a statue of betrayal. 2. "You tell your man Sterling I'll see him in hell," Cole shouted back, his voice raw with defiance. 3. The world exploded in a cacophony of noise and violence. The first volley of shots ripped through the thin wooden walls of the barn, splintering planks and sending dust and splinters flying through the air. Cole returned fire, a single, deliberate shot that made one of the riders yelp and duck behind his horse. The gunfight was a chaotic, terrifying ballet of smoke and death. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Bullets thudded into the barn walls, some passing clean through with a high-pitched whine. Cole was a phantom, moving from one point of cover to another, using the barn's shadows and clutter to his advantage. He wasn't trying to hit them, Lila realized. He was trying to keep their heads down, to make them cautious. He was fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win. A stray bullet struck the lantern she had brought the night before, shattering the glass and spilling oil. A small flame licked up a dry piece of hay. In seconds, a corner of the barn was on fire, thick, choking smoke beginning to fill the space. Lila coughed, her eyes streaming. The heat was becoming intense. She had to get out. She scrambled away from the growing fire, moving toward a gap in the back wall. In the confusion, no one seemed to be watching that side. She was halfway through the opening when a voice shouted, "There, in the back." She froze, caught in the open, a perfect target. She saw one of the deputies, a young man with panicked eyes, swing his rifle around, leveling it right at her. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. Then, a blur of motion. Cole launched himself from the cover of the doorway, crossing the open space in 2 long strides. He slammed into her, his body shielding hers, sending them both tumbling to the hard-packed earth outside. The rifle cracked, the sound deafeningly close. She felt a jarring impact as Cole's body absorbed the bullet meant for her. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp of pain. He lay on top of her for a moment, his weight a heavy, protective shield. "You all right?" he rasped, his voice strained. She could only nod, her throat raw from the smoke and terror. The firing had stopped. The sudden silence was as shocking as the noise had been. Cole slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet. A new, dark stain was spreading across his side, much worse than the old wound. He swayed, but he held himself upright. He looked at the posse, then at Lila, and a look of profound sorrow passed over his face. He knew it was over. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dust with a soft thud. Then he raised his hands, empty and open, a clear sign of surrender. "All right," he called out, his voice weak but clear. "It's done." Sheriff Denton urged his horse forward, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He looked at Cole, then at Lila huddled on the ground, then at the burning barn. His face was a mask of cold,
hard satisfaction. Cole took a staggering step forward. "Just let the girl go," he said, his breath coming in shallow pants. "She has nothing to do with this." Denton dismounted, his boots making no sound in the dust. He walked toward Cole, his movements unhurried, his expression unreadable. He stopped 10 feet away. "You cost me a lot of time and trouble." "Braddock," Denton said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "The trouble's over," Cole said, his hand still raised. Denton smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his sun-beaten face. "Not quite." He raised his rifle. Lila screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from the depths of her soul. No. The rifle shot was a flat, final crack that echoed across the plains. Cole jerked backward as if struck by an invisible fist. The force of the shot spun him around and sent him stumbling, his legs giving way beneath him. He fell down the gentle, muddy slope that led to the river, his momentum carrying him until he came to a stop at the water's edge, half in and half out, in the exact spot where she had pulled him from the flood. His blood, a shocking, vibrant crimson, began to snake out into the brown water. The river, the witness to their beginning, now became the vessel for his end. It accepted his life as indifferently as it had offered it, the current pulling the color from him, mingling past and present, life and death, until they were one. Time did not restart. It simply fractured. In the echoing silence after the final shot, Lila's world was a series of sharp, disconnected images. The acrid smoke from the burning barn, the cold, impassive face of Sheriff Denton, the bright, impossible red of Cole's blood staining the brown river, her father's hand, rough and urgent, pulling her arm, dragging her away from the scene as if she were a disobedient child. She didn't struggle. Her limbs were made of lead, her mind a numb, silent void. They carried Cole's body away, slung over a saddle like a sack of feed. Denton collected the $50 in gold coin from a leather pouch, counting it into Hank's trembling, outstretched hand. The clink of the coins was the only sound that seemed to penetrate the fog in Lila's head. Later, in the cabin, she watched her father place the coins in a small wooden box, his movements furtive and guilty. He did not speak of what he had done, and she did not ask. A chasm had opened between them, a place of such profound betrayal that no words could ever hope to cross it. The days that followed were a waking ghost life. The townsfolk who helped put out the fire that had consumed half the barn spoke in low, pitying whispers. The official story, crafted by Sheriff Denton, was that the outlaw Braddock had resisted arrest and been killed while trying to escape. They said he had taken the farmer's daughter hostage, and that Lila was lucky to be alive. She never contradicted the story. To speak of it, to give voice to the truth, felt like a second betrayal of Cole. Her silence became a wall, and behind it, she nursed her grief, a secret, burning ember. The rumor that he was dead became accepted fact. His name was a cautionary tale told to children, a dark footnote in the brief. Violent history of Copper Creek. For Lila, he was a constant presence, an ache in her chest that never subsided. She found herself walking to the riverbank each evening, to the place where he had fallen, as if expecting to find some trace of him there. But the river had washed away the blood, leaving only the indifferent mud. About a month after the shooting, as the first cold winds of winter began to scour the plains, a stranger appeared at the farm. He was an old man, gaunt and weathered as a piece of driftwood, with pale eyes that seemed to have seen the turn of a century. He was dressed in buckskins and carried a long rifle, a mountain trapper by the look of him. He asked for a drink of water, and while Lila worked the pump handle, he spoke, his voice a low rasp. "Heard what happened here," the old man said, not looking at her but at the scarred remains of the barn. "Heard a man named Braddock was killed." Lila's hand froze on the pump. "That's what they say." The trapper took the dipper of water she offered and drank slowly. "Funny thing about this river," he said, wiping his mouth with a gnarled hand. Sometimes it takes, and sometimes it gives back. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small object that glinted in the pale autumn light. It was the silver locket. He pressed it into her hand. Her fingers closed around the cool metal, her knuckles white. Found a man a few miles downstream, more dead than alive. The trapper rasped, patched him up as best I could. He was gone before the next sunrise, headed west, into the high country. Said to give this to the girl who pulled him from the water. Said to tell her he was going where the law couldn't follow. Lila stared at the locket, her heart a wild, surging thing, alive. He was alive. The knowledge was a staggering blow, a relief so profound it felt like pain. Did he say anything else, she whispered. Her voice choked. The old trapper shook his head. Just that. Seemed like a man who'd had his fill of talking. He nodded at her, a gesture of finality, and then turned and walked away, melting back into the vast, empty landscape as silently as he had come. The locket became her secret. The world believed Cole Braddock was dead, and she let them. His survival was a fragile, precious thing, a flame she had to shield from the wind. But the knowledge changed her. The dull, numb grief was replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. He had survived, and so would she, but the world was not finished with its cruelty. The brand of her association with Cole was indelible. In Copper Creek, she was no longer Lila Mae Carter. She was the outlaw's girl. The women who had once offered her mother sympathetic nods now clutched their children's hands and crossed the street when they saw her coming. The men looked at her with a new, unwelcome light in their eyes, a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Her shame was a public spectacle. Her father, tormented by his own guilt, became even harsher. He had his $50, but it had bought him no peace, only the scorn of his neighbors and the silent accusation in his own daughter's eyes. He began to drink, and his bitterness festered, turning his words into weapons he used against her. The breaking point came on a cold Sunday in November. Thomas Hemlock and his father came to call, a formal visit to finalize the marriage arrangement. They sat stiffly in the small cabin, the air thick with unspoken tension. Lila served them coffee, her hands steady, her face a blank mask. When the elder Hemlock made a crude remark about keeping a better eye on his wife than some men did their daughters, something inside Lila snapped. I won't be marrying your son, she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stared at her, his mouth agape, his father's face turned a blotchy red. Hank leapt to his feet. Girl, you've lost your mind. You will do as you're told. No, she said, standing to face him. She was not shouting. Her calm was more unnerving than any rage. I won't. I won't be a piece of property you can trade for a plot of land. The argument that followed was short and brutal. In the end, Hank raised a hand to her, his face contorted with fury, but he stopped. The look in her eyes was not one of fear. It was something new, something he didn't recognize. It was the look of a stranger. Then get out, he snarled, his voice low and shaking. If you won't be a daughter to me, then you're nothing to me. Get out of my house. She left that night. Her mother, weak and weeping, pressed a small cloth pouch into her hand. It held $3 silver and a piece of cornbread. Be strong. My Lila, Rose whispered, her hand cool on Lila's cheek. Be more than I was. It was the only blessing she received. She walked west, into the teeth of the Wyoming wind. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, the $3, and the silver locket tucked safely in her bodice. The first few months were a blur of hunger and hardship. She learned that the world was even colder and more unforgiving than her father's heart. She learned to sleep in barns and abandoned sheds, to eat what she could find, to trust no one. She was just another piece of human driftwood, a lone woman in a land of hard, lonely men. She found work where she could, mucking out stalls in a livery stable in Laramie, washing mountains of dirty dishes in the back of a smoky Cheyenne saloon. For a while,
She mended clothes for a group of miners in a rough camp high in the snowy range. Her small, neat stitches, a marketable skill after all. It was there, in that camp, that she began to change. She traded her mending services with an old, grizzled prospector named Silas for lessons. He had a Bible and a tattered book of Shakespeare's plays, and he taught her the shapes of the letters, the sounds they made. She was a quick study, her mind hungry for a world beyond her own experience. She practiced by candlelight, scratching letters in the dirt with a stick, then on scraps of paper with a piece of charcoal. Learning to read was like opening a door into 1,000 other lives. Learning to write was like finding her own voice. She grew leaner, tougher. The softness of her youth was burned away by the harsh sun and the biting wind. Her hands were calloused, but they were her own. One night, in the saloon, a drunken miner, emboldened by whiskey, grabbed her arm as she cleared his table. The old Lila would have frozen in terror. The new Lila, the one forged in solitude and survival, slowly turned and met his gaze. Her eyes were as cold and gray as a winter sky. "Take your hand off me," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise of the room. The miner, surprised by her lack of fear, by the hard steel in her voice, hesitated for a moment and then released her, muttering an apology. It was a small victory, but it was everything. She had learned to stand on her own. She kept the locket with her always. It was not a sentimental trinket. It was a compass. She would hold it in her hand during the long, cold nights. The smooth silver, a connection to the man who had taught her about a different kind of justice. He had shown her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of compassion in spite of it. The world saw him as a criminal, a sinner, but he had saved her life, not once, but twice. The locket was a reminder that the law was just a story men told themselves, but that a single act of human kindness could be the only truth that mattered. 3 years is a lifetime. It is long enough for a wound to scar over, for a raw memory to lose its sharpest edges, and for a landscape to change its face. The Wyoming Territory that Lila Mae Carter returned to in the warm spring of 1875 was a different country from the one she had fled. The railroad had pushed its iron spine deeper into the plains, and with it had come a different breed of settler. There were more fences now, more sod houses giving way to proper timber-framed homes with glass in the windows. The raw, untamed wildness was receding, replaced by a stubborn, determined layer of civilization. Lila herself was no longer the same person. The girl who had left in the dead of night with $3 and a broken heart was gone. In her place was a woman of 21 who carried herself with a quiet, unshakable poise. Her face was leaner. Her eyes held a wisdom that had been dearly bought, and her hands, though still calloused, were her own. She had come back not out of longing for the past, but because of it. A letter from the preacher's wife in Copper Creek, penned in a shaky, uncertain hand, had found its way to the boarding house in Cheyenne where Lila worked as a seamstress. It spoke of her mother's decline, of a final, lingering illness that was drawing to a close. And so Lila had boarded a stagecoach, the silver locket tucked safely beneath the collar of her simple but well-made traveling dress, and headed east, back toward the river. Copper Creek had grown. The single dusty street now boasted a small, whitewashed church with a real steeple, and next to it, a one-room schoolhouse from which she could hear the faint drone of children reciting their lessons. The saloon was still there, but it seemed less raucous, less of a focal point for the town's energies. There was a sense of permanence now, of families putting down roots, of a community slowly, cautiously, being born. The walk to her family's farm was a journey through a gallery of ghosts. Every bend in the trail, every familiar bluff and cottonwood tree, stirred a memory of Cole. She reached the sod cabin to find it looking smaller and more dilapidated than she remembered. Her father was in the yard, splitting wood. He was an old man now. The 3 years had stooped his shoulders and leached the anger from him, leaving only a brittle, weary sadness. He saw her. and for a moment, his face was a canvas of shock and shame. He simply nodded, the axe hanging limply in his hand, and gestured toward the cabin door. Her mother was a pale, fragile wisp in her bed, her breath a shallow whisper in the still room. But her eyes, when they saw Lila, lit with a fierce, brilliant love that transcended her sickness. They spoke for an hour, their hands clasped together, sharing the small, important details of the lost years. Lila told her of Cheyenne, of learning to read, of the life she had made for herself. Rose listened, a small, peaceful smile on her lips. In that room, there was no blame, no bitterness, only the quiet, unconditional love between a mother and her daughter. Later, needing air, needing to walk with the ghosts that crowded the small cabin, Lila left and headed for the river. The sun was low in the sky, casting a long, golden light that made the new spring grass glow. The Platte was running calm and clear, a different creature entirely from the swollen, muddy beast she remembered. And then she saw it. Something so new and unexpected it made her stop in her tracks. A bridge. It was half finished, a raw skeleton of new-cut timber stretching from the near bank out over the water. A construction camp was set up nearby, with a mess tent, a blacksmith's forge, and several wagons. It was a sign of the new times, a permanent crossing that would tame the river's unpredictable moods. A small crew of men were packing up their tools for the day, their voices carrying on the still air. Drawn by a curiosity she couldn't explain, she walked closer. She watched the men, their faces unfamiliar. Then her eyes fell on one man who was separate from the others. He was standing on the bridge itself, his back to her, sighting along a length of timber. There was something about the set of his shoulders, a familiar economy of motion, that made her heart give a painful lurch. He was broader than she remembered, his frame filled out with hard muscle from years of labor. He wore a simple flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He turned his head slightly to speak to another worker, and she saw his profile against the setting sun. Time stopped. It was Cole. Her hand went instinctively to her throat, to the place where the locket rested against her skin. It couldn't be. And yet it was. He was older. There were lines around his eyes and a new gravity to his face. A long, pale scar cut a path from his temple down his jaw on the right side, a permanent reminder of a past he had somehow survived. The sight of him, solid and real and breathing, was so overwhelming that her knees felt weak. She stood there for a long moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. He finished his work and turned, walking back toward the bank. His gaze swept the area, and then it found her. His step faltered. The easy stride of a working man became the frozen stance of a man seeing a phantom. He stopped dead, the space of maybe 30 yards separating them. His face was a storm of disbelief, shock, and an emotion so raw and vulnerable it stole her breath. Slowly, as if walking in a dream, she began to move toward him. The other men faded away, the sounds of the camp, the murmur of the river. All of it dissolved into a profound silence that held only the two of them. With every step she took, the 3 years of hardship, of loneliness, of survival, fell away, leaving only the memory of a rainy night in a dusty barn. She stopped a few feet from him. She could see the fine lines around his stormy eyes, the flecks of gray in his dark stubble. He looked like a man who had lived a hard life, but whose spirit had not been broken. He looked like he had come home. "Lila," he said. Her name was a rough whisper, a sound of awe and disbelief. "I heard you were dead," she said, her own voice unsteady. "The reports were exaggerated," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "A trapper found me, took me up into the mountains. I spent a winter with him, healing. Then I went to work in the silver mines up in Colorado. Saved my money." Why, she asked, the question encompassing everything. Why did you come back here? He looked away from her, his gaze falling on the half-finished bridge, on the river flowing beneath it. "I'm not sure I knew myself.
until right this second, he admitted, his voice low. He looked back at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her heart ache. This place, it owes me something. It owes us both something. She felt the familiar weight of the locket against her skin, and a question she had carried for 3 years rose to her lips. A question more important than any other. "Did you ever think of me?" she whispered. The smile that touched his lips this time was different. It was real, and it reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, chasing away some of the weariness. He took a step closer, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Every time I hear running water," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "that river, it pulled me down, tried to wash me away for good, but you pulled me back to being a man." He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching the scar on his own face. "I came back to build a bridge. Lila, I thought it was penance, a way to make something that connects, instead of something that breaks, a way to fight the river. But maybe I was just trying to find my way back to the only person who ever saw me as something worth saving." Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back welled in her eyes and traced a path down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sorrow, but of a release so profound it felt like a homecoming, in the quiet of the fading day, with the patient river flowing beneath them, the outlaw and the farmer's daughter, both survivors of the wilderness, finally found their crossing. The days that followed their reunion were a strange and tender dream, a quiet epilogue to the storm. Lila stayed at the sod cabin, her newfound strength now channeled into gentle care for her mother. Rose Carter, in her final weeks, was blessed with a peace she had never known, her daughter's presence a soothing balm. Cole did not intrude on their fragile time together. He kept his distance, but his presence was a constant, steadying force on the horizon. He finished his work on the bridge, and the first wagon to cross it was the one carrying the doctor from Copper Creek, a journey that would have taken half a day now shortened to an hour. Hank Carter moved through this new reality like a man in a trance. He watched Cole from a distance, saw the quiet respect he showed Lila, saw the way the other men on the work crew looked up to him. He saw a man of substance, not the outlaw he had sold for 50 pieces of gold. One afternoon, Cole was helping Lila mend a section of the cabin's sod roof that the winter had damaged. Hank came out and simply handed Cole a hammer, his eyes fixed on the ground. No words of apology were spoken. None were needed. The simple act of working side by side, of rebuilding what had been broken, was its own form of confession and, perhaps, of forgiveness. When Rose passed, she did so peacefully in her sleep, holding Lila's hand. They buried her on a small rise overlooking the river, a place where the prairie wildflowers grew thick in the spring, at the small, quiet funeral. Cole stood beside Lila, his hand a warm, solid presence on the small of her back. Her father stood on her other side, his head bowed, a man finally broken by a grief he had no right to show, but could no longer hide. Their wedding was not an event, but a quiet moment of consecration. It took place on a bright summer morning, on the bank of the Platte, right next to the sturdy new bridge that Cole had built. The preacher from the new church officiated, his words about union and devotion carrying a special weight for the two people standing before him. Lila wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself. Cole wore a new flannel shirt and had trimmed his beard. The only guests were the preacher's wife and Lila's father, who stood a little ways off, his hat clutched in his hands, a single, difficult tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. They exchanged no rings, only vows spoken in low, steady voices, promises that had already been tested by gunfire and time, as they were pronounced man and wife. Cole did not kiss her with passion, but with a reverence that spoke of a deeper, more profound connection, a joining of two scarred but resilient souls. They did not move away. They bought the small plot of land from her father, the sod cabin included. Hank took his gold coins and the money from the sale and moved into a small room at the boarding house in town. A quiet,
solitary man content to live out his days in the shadow of his past. Cole and Lila began to build. With the money he had saved from the mines and his work on the bridge, they bought timber and glass. They did not tear the old sod cabin down. Instead, they built onto it, adding 2 new rooms with wooden floors and a real stone fireplace. But their most important project was the new schoolhouse. It was Lila's dream, born from the candle-lit nights spent scratching letters in the dirt. Cole drew up the plans, and together, they built it. A single, bright room with 4 large windows to let in the prairie sun. As they worked, Lila remembered something. She went into the old, scarred barn, the place where their story had truly begun, and found the piece of wood she had hidden away years ago, during his long days of recovery, to combat the boredom and to help her with the letters she so desperately wanted to learn. Cole had taken his knife and painstakingly carved the alphabet into a smooth plank of cottonwood. He had made, though, especially ornate, for Lila. She brought the plank to the new schoolhouse and hung it on the wall. On the first day of school, with 12 shy, curious children from the surrounding farms and the town sitting before her on benches Cole had built, she pointed to the rough-hewn letters. "This," she said, her voice full of a quiet, confident joy, "is where we begin." She was no longer the useless, daydreaming girl. She was a teacher, a builder, a woman who had taken the broken pieces of her life and fashioned them into a future. One morning, in the second spring of their marriage, they woke before dawn. A low mist was rising from the river, the same kind of mist that had clung to the water on the day she had found him. They walked hand in hand down to the bank, the world silent and still, holding its breath for the coming day. They stood on the bridge, looking down at the water, a silver ribbon in the pre-dawn light. The sun broke over the horizon, a brilliant, clean light that set the mist on fire and turned the river to gold. The water, the symbol of their chaos and their salvation, now reflected only the promise of a new day. Cole looked at his wife, at the woman who had faced down the wilderness, both outside and within, and had emerged stronger and more whole. The morning light caught in her hair and illuminated a face that was no longer just pretty, but beautiful in its strength and its story. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. "You pulled me from the water, Lila," he said, his voice a low, soft murmur against the quiet sounds of the morning. "But you were the one who learned how to swim through this life. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.